Welcome to WEL Partners on Predatory Marriages, a limited podcast series. My name is Jaclyn, and I'm joined by Daphne Franks, a longtime advocate for better protections against predatory marriages. Welcome, Daphne.
Thank you.
Now, this started because Daphne reached out to Kim, who has, alongside others like Albert Oosterhoff, written a lot about predatory marriages. So in lead up to this podcast, I've released a blog that recaps what a predatory marriage is and a lot of the resources that Kim already has out there. So anyone who's listening to this that is really new to turning their minds to the topic, I encourage you to check those resources out. The blog is linked to in the descriptions for this podcast. However, today I want to hear from Daphne because she has a very relevant story. So Daphne, would you mind telling us a bit about how you got into being such an advocate in the predatory marriage space?
Yeah, it happened to my mother. And I'm in England where the laws are slightly different, but there's a lot of things that are the same. And this was back in 2015, 2016, but I know it's still happening now. How I came to be involved is it happened to my mum. And when I read articles about it, it always says, oh, well, the family should be closer. They should look after their loved one. They should see them. Families these days don't see their parents, all of that. We lived next door. In fact, my mum's house was built in the big garden of our house. We couldn't have been closer. We were 30 yards away from her. And it wasn't that we saw her every day. We saw her all the time. My parents had bought the old family, we had bought the old family home from my parents back in 1999. And they had a house built in the garden, which is where my mum was living and continued living there after my father died in 2008. And in 2009 or 10, we could tell there was something not right with her. She was beginning to be very forgetful. She was beginning to think things weren't quite as they were. Her personality was changing. She'd always been quite very accurate, very academic. And suddenly she was going between somebody who was always smiling and happy and ferociously angry. And that was neither of those were my mum. So we thought there was something very odd. And then this man turned up at a house and he just basically moved in on her, though we didn't meet him for a while. The first we knew were his things were all over her house and some quite valuable things like an iPad. Mum didn't have any kind of computer or anything, and lots of jackets. And when I said to Mum, where have these come from? She said, oh, there's this man. There are a few old ladies he visits. And that first phrase absolutely chilled me to the bone even then. But then the next thing that happened was he seemed to be living with her. And that was really worrying. And she didn't know he was living with her because at that time her dementia was beginning to advance. She never, ever knew his name. She called him Lado, which was her name for some bloke who's around, some chap who's here. And she never knew his name and she didn't know that he was living there. She would say, who is he? Where did he come from? And occasionally she'd say, and this breaks my heart now, she'd say, did you get him for me? I think she thought he was some sort of carer. And in fact, he called himself a carer all the time, even after they were married. I'm her carer. And I was sort of trotting round after him, I felt, saying to everyone, he's not her carer. He's just some man who's moved into a house. It was quite obvious he was living there. He was very, very secretive. She already had a formal diagnosis of dementia. I can't emphasize that too much. And then how did I get involved? Well, after she died, a while later, he turned up at the doctors at my mum's GP, her general practitioner, as it's called in England. He turned up there with a marriage certificate, and the poor doctor to ring me and said, Daphne, did you know your mother was married? And he was really worried about it. I've met him since, and he was kind of, no, it's one of the worst phone calls I've ever had to make, because we had been to everyone. We'd been to all the authorities saying how worried we were about this man. We'd been to the police, we'd been to the social services, we'd been to the police a couple of times actually. We'd seen a solicitor who assured us that there was no way she'd be able to marry because of her
And just
dementia.
clarifying, this was all while your mom was alive too, right? So to your
While
point,
she was
it's not
alive.
like there wasn't
Yeah.
anyone who loved her that was in the picture. You were in the picture and you were going to all these people trying to do
Yeah.
something about the man. Okay, yeah.
We were next door. We saw her several times a day. It was not that we're a family. I know that many families, I have had families on the phone sobbing to me saying I couldn't do anything about my father because he lived 200 miles away. And I was kind of, look, I live 30 yards away and there was nothing I can do. We tried everything. Don't beat yourself up, you know. Um, we were known as a very close family. We always went on holiday together. So the reason I got involved as an advocate against this was two reasons, really. One, my job was as a university teacher, and I'm used to speaking in public. And I thought, what can I do about this? I can talk about this. So that was the first reason. And the second reason was I was just absolutely could see the gaping holes in the laws and procedures that had let this happen. And the only way I could kind of bear it was to make something better come of it. So we started campaigning almost immediately. As soon as we found that out, we went to our MP and he was very, very sympathetic. He listened very carefully. Some of the people that we went to before Mum's death had not listened so carefully. Though I want to emphasize, I'm not blaming any individual or any group. The problems were almost all caused by the laws not keeping up with the rise in dementia, and the same with the procedures at marriage. So, so yeah, after Mum's death, we started campaigning, and our MP listened for a long time and then said, that's terrible. I'm going to raise this in Parliament. And he did in November 2018. And as soon as he raised it in Parliament, he started hearing from loads of other cases, none of whom had been prosecuted. And we'd set up a website and we'd already started hearing from cases. Our website is predatorymarriage.uk, and we just already started hearing from other people. So we just continued. And then I was asked to give a talk at a conference, and that was during the pandemic. But it was online, but there were 750 people there. And obviously, it's a really shocking topic. And lots of them asked me to speak to them, and it's kind of gone from there. For me, it's not about the predator. I never name him in my talks. It's about my mum and all the women and men in vulnerable situations like hers. And let's face it, she was ostensibly a lot less vulnerable than many people because she had us next door fighting for her, but there was still very little apparently that we could do.
You know, on that note, I remember when you told the story to me, one of the most wild parts was the series of steps you took in your mom's life to try and deal with it, and all the people you spoke with, especially since, as we'll talk about a little bit more as the podcast series goes on, you know, a lot of the assumptions that are made and patterns of what happened are very much possible here too in Canada with our laws, which are quite similar. Could you walk us through some of those things? Like what did you try to do when you went to the police, you went to the lawyer? What were those steps you took?
Well, first of all, I think we went to the police very early on. And this was back in 2012, something like that. We went to the police early on, and there was coercive control was not known then, certainly not to the police. And we saw two young policemen, and they just said, well, what do you expect us to do? We can't do anything about it. He's in your mother's house at your mother's invitation. So there's nothing we can do. And I just didn't know how to take that further at that time. I didn't have the knowledge. And then a little bit later, and I realise now it was lack of training and knowledge on the police's part, but later on, a couple of years later, when we went over to see Mum one evening, because we were still going to see her uh, all the time, even though the man made us feel very unwelcome. And one evening, as we were leaving, we heard Mum say to the man, "Did I say what you wanted me to say?" I thought, that is just grooming. We've got to go back to the police. So we booked an appointment, went back to the police, and this time we saw a much older policeman, probably quite an elderly policeman who, again, didn't really know, he didn't understand. He wrote down the whole story. I asked if could be investigated under Clare's law, which is a law in this country about domestic abuse. And he wrote everything down. But when I mentioned Clare's law, he just looked at me as if I was mad. And everything I said kind of made it worse. I said things like, when we went on holiday, he painted our back door blue and he built a shed in the garden. And it was supposed to be for Mum, but she never went in it and it was kept padlocked. I think the policeman just thought I was making all this ridiculous story up. And then when I finished telling him, he looked up at me and he said, "Well, people will say you just don't like him." And I thought, this isn't going to go any further. And it didn't. So that's as far as got with the police. And since then, I've done a lot of work with the police. And I have to say that after Mum died, they really did their best to get him prosecuted, but they didn't succeed because of lack of evidence kept at marriage. We also went to social services and they said they would send somebody round to investigate. And indeed they did. But I had said, please, could you link up with me to make sure I'm there so I'm not out working or whatever, because I was teaching at the time. But they didn't. And I don't know if that's because they wanted to see Mum on her own or whether they just didn't. I don't know. But they went round and then they rang me that evening and they said, "Oh, it's fine, nothing to worry about." It had no safeguarding concerns. And I knew there were. I think he didn't let them in the house, or if he did, they will have seen downstairs, which looked absolutely fine. Upstairs looked a complete tip because the man is a hoarder and he collects jackets off the internet at the rate of about 3 a week. As he said to the police, there's nothing illegal in collecting jackets. No, there's not. But they were all over the upper story, hanging from the landing, all over Mum's bedroom. He'd moved her out of her bedroom into a much smaller room. And there was just general mess up there. And I don't think they saw it. And I had asked that they would look at it. But I think he just charmed them away. These predators tend to be incredibly charming when they want to be and very scary when they don't. I think that is a lot of the problem. So, yeah, we went to the police, the social services. We went to Mum's doctor. And I've worked with doctors a lot because I used to teach at the medical school. I'm not a doctor. I taught non-clinical topics. Um, and I know they don't get much training in safeguarding. And they didn't really know what to do. I said, could you put your heads together and have a practice meeting and come up with some solutions? Well, they rang me and they said, we think you should ring social services. And I was going, yes, I've already done that. So that didn't get us anywhere. And finally, we went to a solicitor. And I didn't really know in those days at all that there were specialist solicitors. So I went to the family solicitor who we'd seen for a number of things. And she had seen Mum with her dementia. So she knew what Mum was like and knew how she had a 4-minute memory at that time. And so I said, could she make a new will? And she said, oh no, she won't be able to make a new will because they've got this thing called the golden rule, whereby if they're struggling to do it, they have to involve a medical professional. Her dementia will stop to that. And I thought, yeah, that makes total sense to me. And then I said, almost in passing, because I didn't think it was that sort of relationship, I said, could he marry her? And the solicitor said, oh no, he wouldn't be able to marry her. There'll be something in place. And that sadly was where it all went wrong. She didn't know what she didn't know. And what she didn't know was there was really nothing in place at that time that would prevent registrars from marrying somebody who who couldn't answer the questions, which is what happened.
From what I've heard from speaking with you, it sounds like, at the end, or potentially ever, your mom never really knew she was married. Did I
No, she
understand that
didn't.
right? Yeah.
She really never knew. And in fact, straight after the wedding, he took her away for a few days to a seaside place called Blackpool, a place she never liked, by the way. But anyway, that's where they took her for a few days and then brought her back, calling in at her brother's house on the way. And her brother was afterwards convinced this was a test to see if she'd remember the wedding. But she didn't. And quite honestly, I just idly timed her memory before the wedding, just for no reason at all. I just had done it. And it was 4 minutes. So he could have brought her straight home. And she wouldn't have remembered even then. But he didn't even give her a new wedding ring. She was wearing my dad's wedding ring that he'd given her until the day she died. And I just thought that was really, I don't know, for some reason that really upsets me along with everything else. So she never knew she was married. She hadn't got a clue. She would of course have, if you get married and then you go to see your brother, you'd generally mention it, wouldn't you? It's just crazy.
And I think a lot of the time in my scope with the law, we talk about property rights and things like that when it comes to predatory marriage. But what do you think the effect really was, if you don't mind sharing? I'm asking this only because you put yourself in the sphere of education and sharing your stories. What do you think the effect this had on your mom? Really in her last bit.
It's really hard to know. And it's one of the things that's really kept me awake thinking about it because he paraded her around everyone. I'm her carer. I'm really looking after her. The family don't care about her. That was always his thing. The same time as keeping the key in the door. So it was really hard for us to get in. And so I have lain awake night after night wondering, what did she think was going on? What she had such a short memory. Was he kind to her? We just don't know. One thing that really upset me was I saw him walking across the room with her, and she was holding his hands, and he was ahead of her, and he was walking quite fast, and she was kind of having to run to keep up, and it just looked awful. Um, it for me with him certainly, and a lot of the other cases have said the same. It's not so much about the money, though they always keep the money. Don't get me wrong, they always keep any inheritance. They've never been known to give it back, as far as I know. But it's about control. And for him and other families I've spoken to, it is as much about controlling the family as about controlling the victim. And that I could see it giving him such a lot of pleasure. Um, and that is really, really sad. So I don't know what Mum thought. I always checked her for bruises. I always checked the food in the fridge, even though he was furious with me for doing that. We continued going to see her, though I always took my husband as chaperone because luckily my husband was working from home at the time. And I, I we found a piece of paper on which the man had written, "What shall I do about the sister?" meaning me. And I found that really scary. And he stopped talking to me. Actually, at about the time he married her, he just talking to me. And if I spoke to him, he didn't reply. And I carried on speaking to him because I'm not 7 years old. I would say good evening, and he would say, and he would stare at the floor or stare at the ceiling or stare straight at me, which I found very scary, and not speak. And he'd always have the television on, and my mum would say things like, Lado, Lado, turn the television off. We've got visitors. Because it was part of her politeness. She was brought up that British politeness. If you have visitors, you turn the television off. And he would say, "I've turned it down, Joan," and he would never turn it off. And I think one of the reasons for that was because of her dementia. Television being on distracted her, so she couldn't really speak to us very, very well. It was so difficult, just awful. Um, and yeah, as I say, that's kept me awake night after night, thinking, what more could I have done? And I realise all the other families feel the same. What could I have done? Should have, could have, would have. I should have done this. I should have gone back to social services. I should have gone back to a doctor. But somehow the gaslighting that goes on makes you feel that big when you knew, or I knew, he was telling everybody that he met, Daphne doesn't care about her mother. And to me, he said, you don't care about your mother. And when she dies, you will cry crocodile tears. I thought, oh, does everyone think that about me? How can they think that? And I felt about this big. And that made, because nobody was believing me wherever I went, or they didn't know what to do, it was so hard to go back. I mean, we went to the police twice. We went to the doctor a few times. I've written loads of letters to the GP. My mum's medical records, which I've got a copy of, is shot through with letters from me saying, I'm really worried about what this man might do. I don't know what it will be, but I'm really worried.
It's a really unsafe feeling environment he created for you.
Yeah.
And not how you would have wanted your mom to spend her last years. I'm so sorry to hear your experience with all this, and I'm very grateful you're sharing it with us. And you know, if it helps with anyone who's listening, hearing something similar. That brings us to the end of our podcast today. Next time, Daphne and I are going to chat about a couple other people's stories and different paths predators took to taking property through marriages and relationships. I encourage you to follow or subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, stay safe and stay well.